series. Today we're very honored and very happy to be joined by Sasha Engelmann. Sasha is known to many of us in the room today. She's a London-based cultural geographer and creative practitioner. Her research centers on long-term collaboration with artist activist communities, working across a number of different domains and different sites. Through these collaborations, she develops arts and humanities-led tools for environmental knowledge making and advances the field of geohumanities. Her past work has involved over a decade of collaboration with the international Aerocene community and studio Tomás Saraceno, participation in DIY and feminist radio arts collectives, including Shortwave Collective and Radio Amatrices, and co-development with Débora Swistun of Sensora, I almost said Sensoria, a community-led air quality sensing initiative in Argentina. She's co-founder with Soph Dyer of the Feminist Satellite Imaging Project and network Open Weather. Sasha is reader in geohumanities at Royal Holloway, University of London, where she teaches at the intersection of geography and the arts and humanities. Welcome, Sasha. Thank you very much. Today's session is connected explicitly to and through the theme of SIAH's research theme that's led by Kwame, and it's on culture, place, and inequality. Those are the main topoi that they range across. And speaking of topoi, we have many that will be ranging across in this particular conversation. And I'm going to kind of kick things off. Sasha, Kwame, and I bounced around some ideas beforehand. And so I'm going to start with a very general open set of relationships, and Sasha can take them where she will. And then Kwame will follow up as you see fit. So I thought I'd start with the large general suggestion that you started off with, which was the elemental as a specific humanistic lens that helps us tell different sorts of stories about environments, ecologies, histories. For example, elemental media studies, theorisations of heat entropy, elemental memory. And perhaps too, you could move from these reflections to discuss how this is related to your collaborative project, A Year of Weather, building infrastructures for weather sensing and with an idea towards a planetary network. And these infrastructures, of course, bring us back to the conversation we had just a few days ago with Lisa Parks. So lots of room to play. It's up to you to take it where you wish. And thanks again for joining us.
Thanks, Brian. That was a really wonderful intro. And I must say, I'm both humbled and privileged and quite terrified to be here in the SIAH Public Lecture Series because Depeche Chakrabarty and Lisa Parks are heroes of mine. And to be in this series, to speak after them is just like a huge privilege and an honor. So yeah, I'm definitely coming from a sphere of thinking on the elemental and elemental geographies. And for a bunch of us thinking in elemental geographical work, the elements have this really interesting kind of ancient resonance. So we can think about the ancient Greek Empedoclean elemental fourfold system of earth, air, wind, and fire, but also the ancient Chinese wuxing system, which also includes metal and wood as elemental categories. But then, of course, in the contemporary moment, we have the periodic table of the elements where the elements are atoms arranged in this diagram that scientists have developed to organize material units that make up the building blocks of molecules that arrange and rearrange and compose and decompose into things that have huge consequences for human and more than human life. So the elemental for me has this really interesting hinge of kind of like ancient categorization, ways of reading the world, even myth making and storytelling and scientific description. What's also really kind of interesting, though, is that there's been a lot of movement around, as Ryan said, elemental media studies. In my field, thinking about the elements as composing milieu, so the elements of having a role in ecologies. And one of my favorite strands is elemental memory studies. where we have people like Christina Sharp writing about the Atlantic as an archive of Black suffering and trauma linked to the idea of residence time, or how nutrients cycle through the waters of the Atlantic over many hundreds of years. Or we have people like Vanessa Barr-Jones, who have written, I really love Vanessa's writing, this one article called What the Sands Remember, about queer intimacy and belonging on the island of Martinique. So I think for me, the Elemental offers this really interesting analytical framework that brings together scientific descriptions of the modern human world, and that's very important, but also humanistic and cultural frameworks for reading the world otherwise, and maybe telling different sorts of stories about memory and history that are not being told in science. My project, Open Weather, is, I guess, tangentially linked to the Elemental in a number of ways. So I kind of see my work as a scholar of elements a little bit separate from my work in the kind of activist artistic network of Open Weather. But Open Weather is an experiment in imaging and imagining the planet using DIY tools of radio. And we have a network numbering around 130 people spread very unevenly around the world, who use DIY radio antennas to capture images from polar orbiting NOAA weather satellites. Crucially, then, they take these images and they submit them to the Open Weather Public Archive, which is our open source archive of weather knowledge and imagery. And they also upload situated weather notes, which are grounded qualitative descriptions of the weather in place, as well as documentation photographs that also help describe weathers on the ground. So in Open Weather, we're really thinking about not just relying on remotely sensed imagery and data, but how does the grounded experience and the vernacular experience of weather kind of intersect with, interfere with, offer interference patterns to remotely sensed satellite images. Our current project is called the Year of Weather, which is what you highlighted. And the Year of Weather is a long duration nowcast. We use the word nowcast to refer to a planetary Earth imaging experiment or event. So in the past, we've done 1 day nowcast where we've invited everyone in the current Open Weather network to capture a satellite image over their location and upload it together with weather notes and photographs to the Open Weather Public Archive, and then using open source tools and the collaboration with the incredible Scottish design studio Rectangle, where Lizzie Malcolm and Daniel Powers. We then analyze, batch process, and georeference and map project these materials onto an equal Earth map that becomes a digital artwork that is related to the Earth on one single day. Nowcasts are, we make a bunch of aesthetic choices so that they do not look like scientific images of the planet. They look like fractal, fragmentary, noisy, glitchy composition of weather. And again, each piece in a nowcast has a direct link to a person on the ground with a DIY antenna who is situated and weathering the conditions that they are recording. So in this durational event called the Year of Weather, we're trying to do this not just on 1 day, but over the course of 1 year, which is an undertaking that the scope of which could be the subject of a whole lecture to do with open source infrastructure building, hardware, software, social relations, mobilizing partnerships in different parts of the world, and really working with people to think about, like, what does it mean right now on a planet that is crossing a threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming over pre-industrial levels, or has crossed that threshold in an uneven way? What does it mean right now to be in a world where access to publicly funded environmental data is every day under threat? Data sets being taken down by the US government as we speak. What does it mean in this climate, in this warming world, to be co-creating planetary images? Again, both with remotely sensed data and also situated stories from the ground. And I guess there's something elemental about that, because it is about kind of the thermocultures of a warming planet and the media that then allow us to communicate and create the archive that we've created.
Yeah, and it is about this kind of embodied nowness.
Yeah.
And how the local scales
Mhm.
and how the now scales,
Mhm.
and how it becomes a way for us to understand both the scientific abstractions of this, the projections of this, but what it means to experience it as a lived embodied thing, and then also the myths that are built around such.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
ancient and contemporary
Mhm.
myths. All right. I just wanted to say to everybody who's in the room, and both here and online, that beginning around 22 the hour, we'll start taking Q&A and open the discussion now. So Kwame, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the last thing that both of you touched on in terms of nowness is something that is particularly pertinent for me as someone who is working on this idea of borrowing your idea of elemental animacy and elemental memory,
Mhm.
but being very cognizant of the nowness factor of the things that we are going through in the world.
Mhm.
And that even though a lot of our discussions around the elements are often connected to kind of like ancient ideas and ancient thinking,
Mhm.
that we are living in a current moment where the advocacy around the issues that elemental animacy may be speaking to require urgency, right? And so I think what I kind of appreciate in the way in which you discussed it, both here today and both in your writing, is the understanding that this is not something that has happened far away, and all of our understanding happens from far away.
Yeah.
It is that we need to continually build and understand from the experiences of people who are looking at it now, that there are stories and experiences that are going to shape the way we think of this moving forward. And more than anything, I think it's this urgency factor. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
looking at in front of me a lot of the discussions that we have in terms of work that we are doing, work that we would like to do, concerns having to fight with, well, what is happening right now,
Yeah.
not what is going to happen once the funding comes in, what is going to happen once the academic year starts, what is going to happen once we have a fixed definition of these things that we're speaking about, but what is this kind of nowness that we're dealing with now? So when you kind of like cite Christina Sharp, who kind of like brings that up in her work about everything is now, it's all now,
Yeah.
that really speaks to me, because when we're thinking about whether it be the bigger climate and environmental issue that we're speaking about, where we're thinking about it in terms of the impact of current governments on what we are able to do in this kind of work moving forward, or how we might think about what these elemental factors might mean to different communities,
Yeah.
a lot of which you kind of like cite in your work, then I think for me, it's always important to kind of like remember that this is not a theoretical exercise. This is an ongoing discussion about the impact that these things are having on people's lives right now. And so therefore, what are we going to do in relationship to people's lives right now, both in terms of immediate kind of like impact, but also in terms of our understandings are continuously happening in the moment in these kind of embodied fashions in which you spoke about. It's happening in the moment, and it's not, can't think of these things as just being connected to kind of like vague ideas of what the elements might mean.
Yeah.
On an everyday lived basis, these elements are creating meaning, and meaning making is happening kind of like in the moment.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. And I think it reminds me of Denise de Phillips' work, her essay on heat, where she says that every molecule of heat, or every molecule that's vibrating with heat in the air around us right now is the direct result of 400 years of capitalism and colonialism and extraction of lands and goods and people and labor over 400 years. but crucially that these energies and extractive forces kind of inhere in the moment right now. So when we think about weather and popular connotations of weather as transient and ephemeral and only happening one day and disappearing the next day, I think bringing that and then having Ferrer de Silva's idea side by side really helps us question like what weather is. And weather is not just the ephemeral present, it is a kind of longer now. It is a now that is informed by hundreds of years of changes that humans have made to the warming of this planet. But the urgency around that, I think, is really important, Kwame. And I think that has had personal connotations for me in the last few months. So in January this year, I had the very strange experience of watching 80% of my home neighborhood in the Palisades in California burn to the ground in the Los Angeles fires, the devastating fires that burned tens of thousands of hectares of land, that burned thousands of homes, businesses, schools, properties, cafes, libraries, spaces of worship, that killed over 25 people. And it was actually on the day that the Los Angeles fires erupted that I heard about the fires, not through the news, but through the Open Weather Archive, because my dad went hiking the morning that the LA fires erupted in the Santa Monica Mountains, the very mountains from which it is thought the spark emerged. And he took his radio antenna up into the mountains, and he was standing on a peak. I've had a very serious conversation with my dad since about hiking during a life-threatening windstorm. But he was on this peak of the mountains, and he captured a satellite image from the top of this mountain. And in his satellite image, you can see the sweep of the Santa Ana wind as it comes from the very arid Great Basin of the American Southwest. This is a very dry wind, so it kind of originates in the desert and it flows westward over California toward the Pacific. And you can see this like really visceral sweep of this air motion in this satellite image. My dad got home to the Palisades. He was midway writing a weather note in which he talks about how there are changing meanings of fire weather and fire season in California. There's one quote where he says, literally, a spark from a power line can ignite the dry chaparral and carry embers great distances. Midway through that note, he starts hearing sirens, and a neighbor texts him and says, Steve, come out and look at the sky. And he climbed on the roof of our house, and he saw this gigantic smoke plume coming from the same mountain that he had been standing on just that morning. And he took a photo of that, and that is also in the contribution. So and the last line of his weather note is that he's evacuating due to air quality. So I could spend like an hour just talking about this one weather note and this one contribution to open weather, because for me, it's really, I mean, it obviously has personal significance, but there's all kinds of ways of narrating climate disaster that come across in this one kind of constellation of a satellite image, a textual weather note, and a series of photos. There are slippages of time and temporality where we see these calm blue skies in the first 3 photographs that my dad took on the mountain, and then the last one is this like billowing smoke plume. He talks about the ember that can ignite the chaparral, and then we see literally the smoke plume happening in the same constellation of materials. So for me, like the urgency of a warming planet, the urgency of telling stories with the elements, and the urgency of narrating climate disasters, not just through like a forensic model or through a kind of linear model of like event, but through the situated relations that happen in place, and through these stories of the elements, through the dryness of the chaparral, through the kind of very heat in the air. So in many ways, the disaster was already there before the spark ignited, right? The disaster has been there since Indigenous communities were forcefully displaced, since their ways of fire management were disrespected, since the arid land has been encroached upon over generations, the intensification of farming practices. So all of these things have been disaster. But in this specific constellation of materials, we see the unfolding of that in very strange ways. And so, yeah, I just wanted to kind of respond to that sense of urgency because this for me actually is one key lens through which I read The Year of Other. Interestingly for me, because I was, of course, a remote family member and I was trawling through news media and social media and drone footage and satellite images just to understand whether our house had burned down over the 24 days that the fire burned. One of the things I came across was this frequent line by reporters and journalists that this was all to do, and it was all because of the devilish and demonic Santa Ana wind. So it was like there was this gesture of like, blame it on the wind, but blame it on the devil's wind, which was very interesting. And there's two things going on here. First is like, blame it on the wind, blame it on this like chaotic, ephemeral force, the best scapegoat really for any disaster, which we cannot control seemingly. So erasing all the things that then prepared the landscape for that disaster, but then animating the wind with a figure like a devil or a demon, which is really interesting to me because I follow scholars like Mel Chen, who wrote an amazing book called Animacies, and thinking about when we see non or inhuman forces animated, when they're given qualities of sentience or humanoidness or liveliness. There is something going on there culturally. It speaks, or it could reveal deeper cultural formations around our imaginaries, our attachments to place, but also even a kind of unconscious, space-time unconscious, to do with how we really relate to the world around us. And there's something about like a devil's wind that to me speaks of like a kind of white Christian American kind of dystopian faded event, which I haven't kind of fully thought through in its complexity, but there's something about that animacy that I think is important. And that when we have this disaster, that is the story that was being told in American media.
Yeah. Also, I mean, a couple of things. One, I don't want to. A couple of things that I find really interesting about that. One is the idea of classifying these things as natural disasters rather than long-term human preparation for which these disasters can occur. I mean, building in earthquake zones, building in zones that have over hundreds of years been prepared for this kind of disaster. I mean, there's a way in which that whole LA complex should not really exist, and certainly not in the configuration that it exists in the contemporary moment.
Yeah.
But also the urgency of that now gets swallowed to a certain extent in the very teletechnologies, real-time technologies that creates an ever-present now that sort of eliminates the past and eliminates the future, where we all live in kind of like a version of Godard's car crash in the weekend. It goes on and on forever. It's just this constant pileup of the now, and that the now is urgent, but it's not because it's replaced by another now almost immediately, so that we lose historical memory, we lose a sense of a hopeful future moment, and the projects that going forward of ideas of remedies and ways in which we can position ourselves to address this urgency get swallowed in this commodified, datafied entertainment complex of real-time social media that you're also using to turn against itself, which is the agenda that it's the critical move of any artistic project, but it's the critical move, I think, of everybody who's engaging in geohumanities, environmental humanities, and trying to understand historical inheritance.
Well, I think so, because these linguistic moves, like animating a wind like a devil or a demon, they have stakes. They have really serious stakes. And so I did a little bit of work on winds, animacies in relation to an article that I wrote for a issue of Media and Environment Journal end of last year. And I was looking at the animating of the Scirocco and Jugo winds of Southeast Europe and the Mediterranean, and how, and many people have observed this, not just me, how when these winds bring Saharan dust to Europe, which happens usually in the spring or in the autumn, they are often referred to in popular media as attacking forces or invading armies. or unexpected guests. And so many people have thought about, oh, that's potentially very racialized, but potentially very significant. But I think it comes back to this gesture of animating, right? So why is it important? Why are we kind of seeing this gesture of ascribing a form of sentience or humanness or agency to an inhuman thermodynamic elemental force, right, which both includes like the wind itself and these dust particles moving with the wind. So why is that repeatedly happening in cultural constructions of these events? And so I think when we have these gestures of animating, we do need to ask questions about where that gesture is coming from. And again, that gesture specifically has stakes for the human bodies who are perceived to originate at the same arid location in sub-Saharan Africa, where Saharan dust supposedly originates. Although if you actually talk to scientists, who I did talk to for this paper, it's actually a much more complicated story. The dust could be originating from the dry Aerocene. It may not even be coming from sub-Saharan Africa. So these narratives have a lot of stakes and they have imaginative weight. And I think we do need to hold on to them when they arise. I just want to say though, animacy is something that has important resonance in history and many cultural traditions, but it's really in the work of Indigenous scholars and communities that I think a lot of Euro-American scholars like myself have learned about animacy. So just to point to work by like Robin Wall Kimmerer on relearning the grammar of animacy, or Vanessa Watts on place thoughts, or the Bawaka Country Collective who talk about co-becoming. So these are places where at least I've learned about animacy in addition to linguistic work in a Euro-American tradition. Yeah.
That issue of media plus and environment is worth looking at. I hear the editors for it are fantastic.
Yeah.
No, but it does touch on the number.
Yeah, I mean, I think taking it back to animacy as you was kind of speaking about it, what I find interesting is that the same kind of racialized language and patriarchal language, that supremacist language that we have in other places, and we also include it in these places as well. So even if we consider the long history of animacy that has run through lots of different marginalized cultures, still at the end of the day, we are kind of coming back to this very Judeo-Christian way of understanding this kind of like devil wind that is going to kind of come in and do these kind of things that in many ways, one erases the other elements that would otherwise be animate by listening to those voices historically, but also erases responsibility from humans who may be immediately involved in what's happening, because then it just becomes the devil's fault at that point, right? And what are you going to do about the devil? Except, pray, I guess is what will be his solution to that.
Exactly, it's probably what they
which is
are asking for.
Yeah. So I mean, I do think it's interesting how animating these elements has been widely adopted in a very specific kind of way that still manages to erase centuries of other people's contributions, or even erase what is actually happening at the core of what these problems are. As you said, there's a preparation for these disasters that is happening to kind of like create them in a sense that gets easily pushed away if you just say, okay, well, it's the devil did it.
Yeah, it certainly conditions of possibility that occur as a result of that. But also, I think that point that you're making about it becomes a monological explanation when the idea of evoking animacy is to evoke a kind of multi-pluralistic discourse around these things. That's one of the purposes, perhaps, in many traditions. Not all, because it operates in different ways. But one of the many things is that if everything is animated, then everything has a say and everything has a voice. But if you just overlay it with a particular monological explanation, no matter whether it's physical or metaphysical in this regard, then it shuts down the conversation. And in different ways of understanding and interpreting the imperatives that are urgently facing us.
Yeah, and I think that's totally right. And I think asking these questions about where these repetitive gestures of animation come from and why they seem to circle around white Christian and or religious figures is really interesting. There are some nuances in these animacies, though. So in my article on women's animacies, I was really interested in seeing how Italian news media and also Western European news media treated the animating of Saharan dust differently than media in the Balkans. And there's a really interesting difference where in Western Europe, there's largely this thing about like invading, attacking forces, and also, oh gosh, what's it going to do with my car? My car could be red, covered in dust, right? Whereas in the Balkans, there's a lot more. I mean, I found it hard to find like an equivalent to the invading army, but there were questions around, I actually need to go and clean the gravestone tomorrow. Like I need to go to the cemetery and clean the grave because there's the Saharan dust coming. And it's going to be really laborious and I'm really upset I have to do it, but I'm going to go and I'm going to go clean the grave. And there's something a bit different happening here where the Balkans, which is a geographical site, which has had a lot of recent trauma, and also where it is a privilege actually to have a gravestone to remember. So my family being from the Balkans originally, like I know firsthand that it's really a privilege that you know where your loved ones are buried, that you can go and memorialize them. So the act of, cleaning a tombstone or a gravestone has cultural significance that is specific to the Balkans, where in Western Europe, it's all about cars. So there's something here about like also kind of these nuances and complexities in how elements are animated and figured in different cultural contexts that have geographical significance, which is part of what I'm also interested in exploring.
Interesting. I mean, that makes me think of the memory aspect of elements that you kind of like have touched upon in your work and the ways in which, what is interesting for me is the ways in which you might think of those memories being collapsed. Because, water is something that I'm particularly interested in at this moment as an element, because in the performance projects I'm working on with Dr. Liz Gray and others, water has been a kind of like very foundational aspect of that performance piece. And so what has been, water then connected to Blackness has this very long and complex history. But if you take, say, the work of someone like Tashima Thomas, who speaks about the Afro-Gothic, there's a way in which we can think of this tragic space of water also being a space of rebirth and life, all happening at the same time. So it's not as if that memory is lost at any point, but it is that there's this everyday lived horror that is happening in these spaces, but at the same time, an everyday kind of lived memorializing, care aspects kind of happening, those kind of things all happening in the same space. And the way in which, for these Black traditions, that memory is collapsed just as a matter of fact. That there is, I'm also thinking about you speaking about the gravestones in the Balkans, because I'm thinking about back home in Jamaica, where this is something that we do every Christmas. My grandfather is buried there, my grandmother is buried there. We have to go back and you clean the grave, you pour some, grandfather liked brandy, so you pour some brandy on the grave. And all of that becomes, talk to them for a while, that becomes an ongoing thing that you kind of have to do. And it's, yes, they have passed away, so therefore there's a historical distance, but at that moment in that space, at that time, standing over that dirt, pouring that liquid onto that dirt, all of that kind of just comes together at the same time. And they're there and they're not there all at the same time. And there is no, what's the word? There's nothing confusing about that arrangement of time and place. It is just as it is. Thinking also of my great-grandparents who were buried in their backyard. You go, you clean it every Christmas or every New Year, that becomes a thing to do, you repaint it. All of that is happening because there is an understanding that in that water, in that dirt, in that liquid, there is a memory and an understanding and a life that is all happening at the same time, regardless of where they are in terms of historical time and memory and those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it's just a really interesting conception of thinking of the elements that I found very useful as I've tried to conceive my work.
There's something in what you just described that was almost choreographic, like the kind of ritual of returning and remembering. And when I was speaking to my family and my mom, who's from Belgrade originally, and writing Louise Animacy piece, I began to understand that it's not that the Saharan dust borne by the Jugo winds is some kind of disruptive force. It's more in the Balkans that it choreographs a collective return, or it choreographs a way of remembering, so that the somewhat not fun labor of cleaning a gravestone actually is part of the choreography of memory that people undertake. And it's part of that kind of seasonal return and transit, because these events happen in the spring and the autumn, kind of at the inflection point between season. And in the Balkans, it's a kind of a point of return and memory that is choreographed with the wind. So again, thinking about the kind of foldings of elemental forces and agencies and materials with human practices of memory keeping, I think this is really interesting.
Yeah, it's a kind of cyclical, gyre-esque kind of way of understanding time that also maps on very clearly with a linear trajectory of time, just as there's a collapsing of physics and metaphysics into those moments. And there's a collapsing of the longue durée in the instant of the ever-present now that is a product of contemporary teletechnologies, but also of the way in which memory operates. Memory in general always operates as a way of scrambling temporalities. That's what memory is. Is a constant memory, and these acts are apostrophes. They're addresses to the missing, to the absent, to the dead. And we're always constantly being reminded of the brief temporal moment that we occupy, yet gets erased at every turn because we're not rewarded for thinking about them. Just to say, before Sasha continues, that we're heading into the Q&A patch of this session already. And so if you have some Qs, Sasha will have some As, and we can talk a bit about them as we move forward. But please just put them in the chat, or if you're in the room and you want to leap in, please do so.
Yeah, I think
Are people typing already?
Stephanie is asking if you can say a bit more about witchy weather.
Witchy weather.
witchy weather.
Yes.
Ooh, wow, I would love Stephanie to talk about witchy weather. Actually, like, I want to know what your take is. Witchy weather. Gosh, I think we do have people in open weather who have written weather notes that do border on the occult, and do kind of along an ancient tradition of weather as an omen of things to come, subscribe to an idea of the future seen through weather. So there's an incredible artist called Pauline Woolley who this winter was writing these evocative weather notes in the archive, also in relation to Storm Eowyn. Not sure if I'm saying that right, but it was a big storm. And there was, she didn't use the word witchy, but there was something very predictive, using ideas of omens, perhaps, like very affective about her weather notes in relation to this storm. And yeah, I'd love to know what Stephanie.
I don't know if Steph can put on her.
Yes, I've got my.
Yeah, lovely. Come on, Steph, weigh in.
Yeah, no, I don't know. Maybe I misheard something you said. I thought that you made a passing mention of witchy weather, and then you were talking about the devil, and I was just, I mean, I work on, I do a bit of teaching on, representation of various kinds of witches in literature, and often they're weather workers. And so it just struck me that there was something about this relationship between the witch and the devil.
Yeah, yeah. Stephanie, thanks for saying that. And I don't think I used the word witchy earlier, but it's such an amazing, I think, figure to put in the room alongside the devil and the attacking army, which are all figures that have figured in this conversation. I will say that I've not been thinking really with witches per se, but around the Los Angeles fires, when I was reading about these devil's winds, I received a YouTube video from one of my uncles with no context. And the YouTube video was two men on a typical, you can imagine, American podcast. And within the first 5 minutes, one of them blamed the entire disaster on the 3 lesbians in the Los Angeles Fire Department. Yes, and the 3 lesbians in the LA Fire Department, and then even speculated that Mayor Karen Bass, who was in Ghana at the time the fires erupted, was also a lesbian. And this is also interesting to me. So what happens when we have this climate disaster, a wind that's characterized as a devil, and then these gestures that are about specifically pinpointing the lesbian orientation of 3 women, possibly also the mayor of LA, who's a Black woman, and characterizing them as lesbian and saying it's important for us to know that these lesbian women are the ones that brought on this disaster. And there's, of course, a whole history around demonizing of women, and that was, of course, a big part of the burning people at the stakes. And so I think perhaps in this constellation that we're building around figures of the devil, we need to think about the figure of the witch. And thanks for bringing that up, Stephanie.
Yeah, that scapegoating and a politics of enmity is very pronounced there. But so is that idea of necromancy.
Right. Yeah.
This constant desire to, and necromancy works at NOAA as well. It's ways of trying to read signs about futures to come, many of which we've already built, some we pay attention to and some we don't. And trying to ascribe agency and cause where it's always a more complex set of relationships, but people don't like complexity. So
yeah.
Is there another?
Not that I can see, but I think you're now contractually required to write about which number. There's no getting away from it now.
It's on the record, yes.
Yeah, definitely something to think about.
Well, can we inflect this slightly differently for a moment and think a little bit about the critical infrastructures that you're using, that you're building on, that you're using against certain sorts of more instrumental applications of it, while doing a different kind of instrumental application. And what does it mean to kind of ride along these things and use them against themselves in a particular way?
So I think what you're alluding to is that I do build lots of infrastructure with
Yes,
open weather. And it's not something that I really thought I would do when I founded this project. I should say open weather is I co-lead open weather with the incredible designer and researcher Soph Dyer, who does incredible open source investigative work, works in the human rights sector, and is a really accomplished visual artist based in Vienna. But what has happened with open weather is that we kind of accidentally built this uneven planetary network of people. These are people who largely have zero training in science or engineering or technology. And through writing how-to guides and offering resources, this network of people have kind of skilled up and created their own DIY satellite ground stations. And this is the network that I speak about when I talk about the open weather network. But linked to that, and especially because of the year of weather, because it is in many ways very laborious to manually capture a satellite image. So you have to predict the satellite orbits and be using some witchy tools. Go outside, track the satellite, come back inside, decode the data, upload the data. So there's a whole like laborious process in doing that. And because we wanted to do this durational nowcast experiment happening over the course of 1 year, we realized we needed hardware and we needed like hardware infrastructure. So back this time last year, we began working with a programmer and artist called Grace and Earl in Berlin to prototype Raspberry Pi based automatic satellite ground stations, which is a mouthful to say, but it's basically a small box which has a Raspberry Pi computer inside it. And the Raspberry Pi, using open source code, calculates the NOAA satellite orbits over your location. It selects the highest elevation pass of the day. And when you link it up to a radio antenna that can be mounted on your roof, it records the satellite path. And then it, over Wi-Fi, automatically uploads that to our Open Weather archive, where it is decoded and map projected on a georeference map of the planet, which is loading every hour. So through this work, we've now deployed, I think, 14 or 15 automatic satellite ground stations in places like Valparaiso with the artist collective Tsunami Arte Sonoro, to Cambodia with the Oppressive Heat Project, thinking about heat again, to seaweed harvesters in Cornwall. We worked quite selectively with different communities and groups to put these stations in places where people had, again, situated relations to weather, and they would use these stations also for their own purposes. So through all this work, we actually have built infrastructure that is capable of capturing images from NOAA weather satellites every single day, every single hour. And this is important because on June 16th, NOAA is going to terminate the vast majority of instruments on board the 3 remaining analog NOAA satellites, who are the satellites that we use. This comes alongside a wave of other actions by NOAA. So in May, NOAA announced it was going to decommission 16 environmental data sets.
Sure.
This is data on ocean currents, on geothermal sites, on seismicity. You know, this is publicly funded environmental data that has been already or will be in the next 2 weeks taken offline and will no longer be available, amounting to what the Union of Concerned Scientists called public theft. So the satellites being turned off is just one piece of this larger puzzle. And of course, we can put this together with the fact that 3,000 people from NOAA have recently been fired by Trump. And that NOAA's budget in some departments will be cut up to 75% in 2026. In fact, what really worries me, honestly, is that there's a specific collaboration between NOAA's Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Center, OAR, and a specific laboratory at Princeton. And since the 80s, this collaboration has produced what is probably the most precise climate model we have today. And I have critical perceptions of climate models, but this collaboration, again, the funding is set to be cut by 75% in the next few months. So anyway, so we are now, as an artistic project, we've built infrastructure, and we're now at this precipice of the satellites that we use being almost completely turned off. What we do know, though, is that the specific transmission that we use for open weather will remain enabled after June 16th. It just won't be analyzed or distributed by NOAA.
Oh.
So, which is weird, because why would they keep it? Why would they keep it enabled if they're not distributing it? What that means is the only way to get these satellite images will be through infrastructure on the ground, like hardware, antennas. And we weirdly have one of the infrastructures on the ground for receiving these images. There is one other network called SatNogs who do also archive NOAA images, but not in visual form, and they don't map project. So it could be after June 16th that we are like we have the only infrastructure for sharing and distributing these images in the absence of the US government.
Do you have the capacity to create data sets out of this?
So this is like such a good question, Ryan. I was talking to Kwame earlier about this because I think we're in this really uncomfortable position because we never intended to replace NOAA. We never meant to be like a replacement. It was always about critically intervening and engaging with these images made by a scientific agency. So it was never about doing what NOAA does. But now in this phase of terminating of services, like what duty of care do we have to the images? What duty of care do we have to the infrastructure? How does that change how we as a little artistic project, currently unfunded, I might add, like operate? And I don't think we have an answer. I think I think usually we are led by the network in making these kinds of decisions. But it could be after June 16th that we have other communities approaching us that need certain kinds of data that we don't currently have the capacity to produce. And what will we do when that happens? So, yeah.
That's right. A number, but I think it is interesting too, the way in which we were talking about pluralistic voices, antiphonal voices that are at play within this, and the kind of supplementary infrastructure that you built upon is now the main ode.
Yeah.
That's being sung here. This is it's no longer the para ode sung alongside the main one. This is the one. And that position, that shift of supplementing to becoming the text, the logos, as it were, that's delivering this. That's an altogether different enterprise. And as you say, you don't have the money to do it. You don't have the time to do it. All you have is the willingness and good faith of the people who are involved with it on the ground.
Yeah, and I would invite anyone who's interested, who's here, just to go look at our Year of Weather map, because I think you'll see what I mean, how different it is to a scientific Earth image. So you can find it on the Year of Weather page, project page on our website. And it's this really textured map. You can't zoom out. Actually, you have to hover at median level over Earth's surface and kind of scroll and move your way around. And that puts you right up against like the noises, the interferences, the glitches that are the record of people's ground station positions, their urban environments, their bodies, even if they're holding the antenna. So it's really an archive of glitches. It's an archive of noises. And it's meant to be an aesthetic experience. It's meant to be a digital artwork. Not necessarily like a standalone record of planetary conditions. So,
but it would be interesting moving forward if this archive of noises and glitches becomes the archive that is being referenced.
It becomes the signal.
Yeah, because I think in many ways we did not ask for this responsibility in any way, but I think in many ways, this is the kind of thing that we would kind of hope would happen, that if we are going to be using, particular data sets and records and archives as kind of like reference points, that they are these kinds of, feminist-led, community-led kinds of work that are taking very seriously the glitchiness of understanding the beauty and aesthetic of how these things could be shaped and understood. If that is able to kind of like lead how we think about climate moving forward, then it's a kind of tragic beauty to it. He didn't ask this. You're not in this position, but
thanks, Elon Musk.
Now that's on record. So we're gonna just
that's a good clip. I will live in infamy. We have just a couple more minutes. If there's one more comment, question, thought that people in the audience would like to offer, that would be terrific.
I think my question would go off on the rails to just talking about open source stuff, so I'm not sure what.
please.
we answer this out.
Yeah.
Thanks. But my first thing is, could you tell me the date of the nowcast that your dad took for the file? What was the date again?
Yeah, so the contribution my dad uploaded was January 7th, 2025. And if you go to our public archive and search Steve
Yeah.
Engelmann, you'll
I
find.
got the page, but I couldn't work out which date.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that's cool. Yeah, but I guess my question is more about how like top tips, tricks and whatever around growing an open source community.
Wow, yeah.
Because I have an open source project,
Uh-huh.
it's been going quite well. We're about to move into a phase of sort of growing the community. It's a very different project.
Mhm.
And it's more about contributors to the code base potentially or doing those kind of things. So I just wonder whether you had any kind of, from your experience, what the pitfalls may be that I should avoid, and then what have you kind of enjoyed about that community building?
Okay.
So I'm saying it's a bit off track.
Just for people online, the question has to do with how do you build an open source community that's collaboratively working together in the way that Open Weather does, and what sorts of strategies are productive and what to avoid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very topical because I just was at the Open Hardware Summit in Edinburgh like 3 days ago. And there's tensions in the open source community. There's tensions in open source network building, and I don't have an easy answer for you. I think for us, it was we didn't like build or initiate Open Weather from an open source ethical position. So it's always been an intersectional feminist position that then, because of that position, led to creating tools that were open source, and also because crucially of my collaborator Soph's connections in the programming sphere. So working with Rectangle Studio, who are brilliant open source programmers, and Grayson Earl in Berlin, who's a very talented programmer who coded our automatic ground station code. So I think we've arriving at open source has been really, we've arrived there from thinking about data feminism, really, from thinking about a politics of location, from thinking about like environmental or access issues, and trying to build a project and a network that didn't exist at the time of mine Soph's learning how to do this work back in 2020. Simply because there were no accessible how-to guides, no accessible resources on how one could capture these satellite images using cheap or zero cost hardware and open source software. So we've, in many ways, we haven't invented anything. Like we've not done anything that wasn't already being done before. We've just committed to access, and committing to access then led to the network. And then through committing to access, it became very clear that we had to commit to open source. That being said, there are still loads of issues around privacy, around people's private data, around the public archive as a public space. So if you're curious about this, we have a data MOU on the public archive webpage you can download. And we have thought quite carefully about how people can use the data. And yes, so.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a data issue because it's all peer-to-peer, so none of the data's collected anyway.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I'm avoiding that, but didn't we? Okay, yeah, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't help you directly with your.
No.
No,
No, I guess just really quickly follow up. You said you came at it from an intersectional feminist position.
Yes.
If I want to look up some stuff about that,
Yes.
Where do I start?
Please do. So we have the Open Weather Feminist Handbook is freely available as one of our key resources on our website. In fact, we treat our feminist protocols as equal in importance to the hardware, the DIY antennas, and even the satellites. So that, like, our feminist principles are really the building blocks of this project. They are not tangential, they're not descriptive, they're not theoretical, they are like real material principles. And we have like 12 or 14, which are listed using accessible language and specifically how they inform our work, and then a series of references under each.
There you go.
Sorted.
Yeah.
Well-placed question to wrap it all up with. So with that, it just leaves me to thank both Kwame and especially Sasha for joining us again for what was another in the endless series of